Firstly, Laura, we heard from the Treasurer there that this will destroy the budget, were his words, I think, and was it devastate the economy? Not specific numbers, but clearly the view from the government and I assume from Treasury is that this would hurt.
Well, yes, and of course one of the interesting things here is that the government has been cutting back the numbers, so in some ways you could say, well, all Peter Dutton is doing more of it. But I think the crucial point here is that Peter Dutton has been picking various numbers and changing his story on what he's actually aiming for. But as far as I can understand it now, he's talking about cutting net overseas migration.
Well, let me just show this to you, right? Just because there are a bunch of numbers here, it can get confusing. So this is the permanent migration number. This is what he talked about on the budget reply speech. On the left there is this current year's permanent migration intake. The yellow part is the skilled component of that, and the top is family reunion. The middle column there is what Labor is forecasting for next year. So it comes down the permanent migration intake, but not by much. And then on the right is what Peter Dutton is saying, and that's bringing that permanent number down under the coalition to a smaller number of 140,000. But net overseas migration is the bigger figure. It includes permanent and temporary, and there's been this big post-COVID spike in temporary students coming and so on. On the left there, the yellow one, that shows us this current financial year, net overseas migration coming in at just under 400,000. Labor says next year it'll be 260,000. They'll get it down to 260,000. But Peter Dutton, in those interviews he did the morning after his budget reply, started saying he'd be able to get that number down to 160,000.
So that he's talking about an extra 100,000 people not coming to Australia. Now, he hasn't said how he's going to actually achieve that. The only real vehicles to do that are via overseas student numbers and, dare one say, working visas of people who might work on farms.
They're saying, I checked with them as to whether this was a mistake and they said, no, this is part of the plan. Okay. And they're saying, look, not interested in touching the backpackers. And I think the Nats have some pretty strong views. They don't want to touch the backpackers, and they wouldn't touch tourists. So it almost has to be just students. So it has to be students.
Now, in economic terms, that has a huge implication. Massive. The government is already talking about cutting the number of overseas students. Let's just think about the trajectory here. We threw a whole heap of them out for the pandemic. Scott Morrison then announced that students could get could basically work whatever hours they wanted to in an effort to encourage them back in. As a result, we got a huge surge in student numbers and other visa holders. That started to ease off because the government put a cap on those working requirements.
So you can only work 20 hours, I think it is, a week.
That's right. And let's face it, it's about working here. It's not necessarily about studying here that is driving this as a pull factor. Now, if Peter Dutton's going to cut that by 100,000, it means a lot less workers, a lot less people in the economy. Now, he might say that that has a positive impact on housing, but it doesn't necessarily have as big an impact as you would think it would, because essentially the number of people coming here and sort of sitting here on temporary visas doesn't necessarily fall. It just doesn't go
a lot of those, I think, 70% of those who win a permanent visa are already here on a temporary visa. Phil?
Yeah, we saw that after COVID when there was those giant labour shortages, because all the students hadn't come back yet. Remember, cafes couldn't open and things like that. So this would if he were to cut students by that amount, that would be one side effect of this. Chalmers is interesting because Labor, as Laura said, is proposing to cap students, but not like the Canadians did with a hard cap. So this is how many we're going to have, but to cap the number each institution could have. So
this university can have that many.
Yeah, both sides recognise it's a problem, and the numbers have to be brought down, but it's how you do it. Now, Chalmers, during the budget process, there were calls to follow the Canadians and put on a hard cap. He said no, after commodities, international students are our largest exports. Commodities aren't going so great at the moment, and the way it's going with climate change and stuff. So you've got to do this in a way that doesn't damage the industry for the long term to fix a short-term political problem. Yeah. So Labor did it in a more nuanced fashion.
So look, but the pitch from Peter Dutton is a pretty simple one. We're going to go harder in cutting immigration, and here's what he says: it's going to help fix the housing problem.
My decision is to prioritise Australians for housing in our country because we've got people living in tents, we've got people living in cars. I want to see them in housing.
Sounds fair enough, Peter, but when you do get to the detail of, well, who are you going to stop coming? There's a list of skilled workers that come in under the permanent migration program. Nurses and midwives at the top. I mean, no one's going to say, or aged care workers. Then you've got a lot of teachers coming in. Yes, IT specialists, accountants. Liberals say, well, we probably have too many accountants coming in. But there's a lot on that list they wouldn't want to touch.